Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through Craigslist on my laptop. My son, Adam, was turning 18 in a couple of weeks, and I'd been looking for a car to surprise him with for months. He didn't need anything fancy, just something reliable to get him to college and back. We'd saved up around $4,000, and I was hoping to find something decent in that price range. Most of the listings I'd seen were either way out of our budget or looked like they'd been driven through a war zone. But then I stumbled upon something that caught my eye, a 2003 Toyota Camry, only 67,000 miles, for $3,500. The description said the car had no accidents, no mechanical issues, and had been well maintained by a single owner. It sounded too good to be true, but the pictures looked great, and the price was perfect. I didn't waste any time. I sent a message through Craigslist, and within an hour, I got a response. The guy's name was Robert, or Bob, as he called himself. He seemed friendly enough over email. He explained that the car had belonged to his father, who had passed away recently, and he needed to sell it because it was just sitting in his driveway. He said he was willing to meet up that evening, and we could take a look at it. Bob gave me an address out in the suburbs, about an hour's drive from my house. The place was in a more rural part of the county, where the homes were farther apart and the streets quieter. I was excited and didn't want to lose the opportunity, so I grabbed $3,500 in cash from the bank, thinking I could probably negotiate the price down a little. I figured if the car was as good as he described, I'd walk away with a pretty great deal. I didn't tell Adam about the trip. I wanted it to be a total surprise for his birthday. Besides, I've always considered myself a good judge of character, so I wasn't too worried about driving out to meet some guy from Craigslist. I'd done this kind of thing before, buying used stuff off the internet, meeting strangers for deals. It had always been fine. As I drove out of the city and into the countryside, the scenery started to change. The houses became fewer and farther apart, and the streetlights disappeared. It was late afternoon by then, and the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the road. I pulled up to the address Bob had given me. It was a small, one-story house, sitting alone on a large plot of land. There were no neighboring homes in sight, just a lot of empty space and some trees in the distance. There was an old pickup truck parked in the driveway, and I could see a clutter of car parts and tools scattered around a garage that was attached to the house. But there was no Toyota Camry. I figured maybe it was in the garage or parked out back. I got out of my car, taking a quick look around. Everything seemed eerily quiet. No dogs barking, no kids playing, no signs of life. The place had a kind of abandoned feel to it, like no one had lived there in a while. I walked up to the front door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out. "Hello? Bob? It's Eric. I'm here to see the Camry." Still no answer. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Bob had given me. The call rang twice, and then I heard it, a ringtone, muffled but coming from inside the house. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was his phone. He had to be here. I knocked again, louder, trying to stay calm. Maybe he didn't hear me, or maybe he was just in the back working on something. But after a couple of minutes with no response, I started to get uneasy. Something wasn't right. Why wouldn't he answer his phone or come to the door if he was expecting me? I stepped back off the porch, looking around. I was about to get in my car and leave when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Through the front window of the house, partially covered by a set of tattered blinds, I could see a figure standing still, facing the back of the house. At first, I thought it must be Bob, maybe waiting for me in the backyard or something. So, I walked around the side of the house, calling out again. "Bob? You back there?" As I rounded the corner to the backyard, I froze. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. The figure I'd seen through the window wasn't Bob. In fact, it wasn't even a living person. It was a human body, or what looked like one, but it wasn't moving. The person was standing perfectly still, unnaturally stiff, and as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a real body at all. It was some kind of stuffed figure, like a mannequin, but more grotesque, like a taxidermied corpse. The skin was discolored, pale and rubbery, with a vacant expression on its face. I backed away, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why the hell would anyone have something like this in their house? I turned and sprinted back toward my car, fumbling with my keys. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but just as I reached for the door handle, something made me look back at the house one last time. The window where I'd seen the figure was now closed. The blinds had been pulled down completely. And behind them, through a small crack between the slats, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of eyes. Watching me. I didn't stick around to see who, or what, they belonged to. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and peeled out of there, tires screeching on the gravel as I floored it down the empty road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The entire drive back felt like a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights chasing me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road ahead of me and the suffocating fear that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than a Craigslist scam. By the time I got home, it was dark, and I was shaking. I locked all the doors and windows, pacing around the house, trying to calm down. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped. It was a message from Adam, asking when I'd be home. I didn't tell him anything about what had just happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to that place. It was the summer of 2009, and my parents had just bought a new house that needed some serious renovation. It was the kind of place they had dreamed of for years, out in the countryside, far from the chaos of the city. But with all the repairs, it wasn't livable yet. So one weekend, they decided to stay in town to oversee the renovations and sent me to my uncle's farm. Uncle Frank wasn't exactly the warm, welcoming type. He was a man of few words, always busy with his farm, solitary by nature, and honestly, we weren't very close. Still, I didn't mind the idea of spending a couple of days out there. I figured it would be quiet, and I could just relax, maybe watch some TV in peace. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed in the guest room, a small, dimly lit space on the second floor that smelled faintly of old wood and farm dust. The wind was howling outside, but that was typical for an open field like Uncle Frank's farm. I spent most of the evening watching late-night TV until I drifted off. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then came the second night, the night I'll never forget. A huge storm rolled in on Saturday. I mean a real storm, the kind where the sky turns black in the middle of the afternoon, and the air feels thick and heavy, like it's warning you to take cover. The wind picked up fiercely, whipping the trees around the house. By dusk, the rain had started, and by the time night fell, it had become a torrential downpour. Thunder boomed so loudly that it rattled the windows, and lightning lit up the sky every few minutes, turning the fields outside into an eerie, flashing sea of shadows. I wasn't too worried. Sure, the storm was intense, but I figured it would pass eventually. Uncle Frank, as usual, didn't seem concerned. He went to bed early, leaving me alone to continue watching TV in the living room. Around midnight, though, the power flickered a couple of times before cutting out completely. The house plunged into darkness, and the comforting hum of the television died, leaving only the roar of the storm outside. I felt a bit uneasy. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere during a storm that makes you feel isolated, like the whole world has disappeared and it's just you and the elements. But still, I wasn't too concerned. I decided to head to bed, figuring I'd fall asleep to the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the near-pitch black room, I heard a strange noise outside. It wasn't the wind or the rain, no, it was something metallic, a sharp clanging sound, almost like someone hitting metal against metal. It came once, then again, and I dismissed it as just something loose in the storm. But it happened a third time, then a fourth. It wasn't rhythmic, and it wasn't random either. It was like someone or something was out there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a piece of farm equipment blowing around in the wind maybe. But the more I listened, the more deliberate it sounded. And with every rumble of thunder, the metallic sound seemed to follow. My nerves started to tingle, but I didn't want to disturb Uncle Frank. We weren't close, and I didn't want to be the paranoid city kid overreacting to some farm noises. Still, the sound wouldn't stop. My curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, finally got the better of me. I threw on my jacket and tiptoed down the creaky stairs. The living room was even darker now, with no TV to cast its faint glow, and the storm outside felt closer, more ominous. I could hear the wind howling, rain battering the house, and in the distance, the same metallic clanging. I approached the window that looked out over the front yard, but with the rain coming down so hard, I couldn't see much. The occasional flash of lightning would briefly illuminate the outside, but nothing caught my eye, just the field stretching out into the blackness, with the barn far off to the left. Then I heard it again. This time, the metallic clanging was much closer. I hesitated for a moment, standing there in the dark, trying to make out where the sound was coming from. The next lightning strike was almost blinding, lighting up the entire yard in a sudden burst of blue-white light. And in that split second, I saw someone, down by the entrance to the basement, hunched over, hitting something metal against the door. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone out there, dressed in dark, rain-soaked clothes, crouched low at the basement door. And it wasn't an accident. Whoever it was, they were trying to break in. My heart raced as I stood frozen by the window, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Another flash of lightning came, and this time the figure was clearer. They were holding some kind of tool, a crowbar, maybe, and they were hammering it against the lock on the basement door. I could see the glint of metal, the force of each blow. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should I wake Uncle Frank? Call the police? Confront whoever it was? But the most terrifying realization was that if they got into the basement, they'd have access to the whole house. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to think. But then, another sound stopped me cold, a different sound, coming from directly outside my window. A soft scratching, followed by a slow tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned my head toward the window. In the dim light of the storm, I saw the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My stomach dropped, and I felt like time itself had stopped. The person, the one who had been trying to break into the basement, was now standing outside my window, staring directly at me. They must have heard me, seen me, something. The face outside the window wasn't clear, just a dark figure with their head tilted slightly, as if they were examining me. The glass fogged with each of their breaths, and in the brief flicker of lightning, I saw the glint of their eyes. They were watching me, waiting. I snapped back into action, adrenaline flooding my system. I slammed the window shut and locked it, then bolted from the room, running down the hall toward Uncle Frank's bedroom. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I could barely think straight as I pounded on his door, trying to get the words out. "Uncle Frank! There's someone outside! They're trying to break in!" It took him a few moments to wake up and process what I was saying, but when he did, he moved fast. He grabbed the shotgun he kept by the bed, threw on his boots, and without a second thought, rushed out into the storm. I wanted to follow, but my legs felt like jelly, and all I could do was stand there, trembling, listening as the door slammed behind him. Outside, the storm raged on, and for what felt like an eternity, I heard nothing but the wind and rain. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. Uncle Frank had rushed out so quickly that I didn't even have time to react or follow him. All I could hear now was the storm, violent gusts of wind rattling the windows and the relentless hammering of rain on the roof. The house felt eerily quiet without him inside. Every creak, every rustle sent shivers down my spine. My mind kept replaying the image of that face outside the window, the cold, predatory way they had been staring at me through the glass. I didn't dare move, terrified that whoever it was might still be lurking nearby. I strained to hear any sounds from outside, hoping Uncle Frank would shout or fire a shot or something. But all I got was the occasional rumble of thunder, muffled by the thick walls of the house. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the front porch. For a second, my brain struggled to process what I was hearing. Maybe Uncle Frank had returned already, I thought. Maybe he had scared the intruder off. But the footsteps were slow, deliberate, and the heavy boots Uncle Frank always wore didn't make that soft, eerie thudding sound. These footsteps were lighter, cautious, almost as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. Panic surged through me again. I backed away from the front door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My eyes darted around the dark hallway, looking for a place to hide, when I heard something else, a faint creak, like the sound of the front door's old hinges moving ever so slightly. My stomach dropped. I didn't hear the door open fully, but it was enough to let me know that someone was right there, just inches away from stepping inside. I bolted. My instincts screamed at me to get upstairs, so I ran back up to the guest room as quickly and quietly as I could, practically leaping up the staircase 2 steps at a time. My only thought was to find a place to hide, maybe under the bed, or in the closet, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. I reached my room and quickly shut the door behind me, but I didn't lock it. Locking it would make a noise, and I couldn't risk it. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. I strained my ears, listening for any indication that someone was coming up the stairs after me, but all I could hear was the storm outside. My thoughts were racing. Where was Uncle Frank? Had he found the intruder? Or was he still searching the farm? I couldn't tell if the silence was a good or bad sign. Suddenly, there was another noise, a low creak coming from downstairs. I froze. The floorboards in the living room were old and worn, and they made that specific sound when someone stepped on them. Someone was inside the house. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my fear in check. My breath was shallow, my hands were shaking, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to hide. I crawled under the bed, my body pressed tightly against the cold wooden floor, my heart racing so loudly that I was sure they would hear it. The storm outside continued to rage, but it was the silence inside the house that terrified me the most. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the wood seemed deafening in the quiet. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was only seconds, it was impossible to tell. I listened for the sound of footsteps, for any indication that the intruder was getting closer. But then, as I lay there in the dark, something far worse happened. The doorknob of my room twisted. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the storm rattling the house, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard the soft, unmistakable click of the door being pushed open, followed by the quietest of footsteps entering the room. I stopped breathing. The footsteps were slow, methodical, as if the person was searching for something, or someone. I could see the shadow of their legs moving across the floor, just a few feet away from where I was hiding. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I was sure they could hear it. The lightning outside illuminated the room for a split second, and I saw the outline of the intruder's legs, dressed in dark clothes, just like before. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, almost as if they were enjoying the hunt. The footsteps grew closer. I could see their feet now, just inches from the edge of the bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't look underneath, praying they wouldn't find me. I heard a soft breath, so close that I could almost feel it. They were standing right next to the bed, hovering there, waiting. The silence was unbearable. The only thing louder than the storm was the sound of my own pulse. The intruder stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, as if they were listening for any sign of life. I bit down on my lip to stop myself from making a sound, my entire body tense, every muscle screaming with the urge to run. And then, without warning, they moved. The footsteps retreated, slowly but surely, back toward the door. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, not daring to believe that I had gotten lucky. I heard the door creak open further, then close with a soft click. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. I stayed under the bed for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe loudly. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that? What did they want? And why didn't they search harder? Eventually, I forced myself to move. I crawled out from under the bed, my muscles stiff and sore from the tension. My legs felt weak, like they were barely capable of holding me up. I tiptoed over to the door, pressing my ear against it, listening for any sound. But the house was silent. I cracked the door open just a little and peered out into the dark hallway. There was no sign of the intruder. I stepped into the hallway, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I crept downstairs, one step at a time, every creak of the old floorboards sending a jolt of panic through my chest. When I reached the front door, I noticed it was still slightly ajar. I rushed over and slammed it shut, locking it, my hands trembling. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the door, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that Uncle Frank returned. His clothes were soaked, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked shaken, but he hadn't found anyone. The farm was empty, the storm had passed, and the fields outside were quiet again. We went down to the basement together, and sure enough, the lock had been almost completely destroyed. The intruder had been just seconds away from getting inside when I had spotted them. Uncle Frank didn't say much, but the look on his face told me everything. He was as rattled as I was. We never spoke about it again after that morning. I left the farm later that day, thankful to get away from that house. And although nothing like that ever happened again, I could never shake the feeling that whoever had been outside that night wasn't just there to rob us. They were waiting for something, or someone. And I almost gave them exactly what they wanted. It was a Wednesday night in October 2017. The weather was awful, with heavy rain pounding on the streets, and gusts of wind howling through the alleys. That night, I decided to go to the movies. I'm not a fan of crowded places, so the thought of a near-empty theater was appealing. Plus, I didn't have a fixed schedule, so a random midweek movie was perfect for avoiding people. I picked a film that had been out for a while, something obscure that barely anyone would want to see. I wasn't really there for the film, just the peace and quiet. After buying my ticket and grabbing some popcorn, I made my way into the dark, cold theater. The air conditioning was running too high, as usual, but I liked it that way. The place was almost completely empty, just as I expected. I went to the back row, the highest seat in the middle, my favorite spot. From there, you could see the whole screen without having to strain your neck, and no one could sit behind you. I settled in, enjoying the quiet hum of the projector as the trailers began to roll. The first 20 minutes of the movie were uneventful, as I sat there with my attention mostly on the screen, but my mind occasionally wandered. The film wasn't particularly gripping, and I found myself more focused on how comfortable I was. There's something soothing about being in an empty theater, the world outside forgotten for a while. And then, something strange happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement a few rows ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had come in late and sat down without me noticing. But then I realized, whoever it was, they weren't sitting in their seat like a normal person. They were crouched low, almost lying flat between the rows of chairs, as if they were trying to hide. Their head poked up just enough to be visible, and they were staring straight at me. The film was in a dark scene, so it was hard to make out any clear details, and I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light. But when the screen brightened, my heart skipped a beat. The person's face was pale, ghostly white. Their hair was wild and matted, sticking out in clumps. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but whoever it was, they were staring at me. And not just in a casual glance sort of way. This was a full, unwavering gaze, their eyes locked onto mine. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The rational part of my brain told me not to overreact. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to freak me out for fun. I looked away, pretending I hadn't seen anything, and forced myself to focus back on the movie. The theater was quiet again, and I convinced myself that the person had stopped whatever weird thing they were doing. But that feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance down at the rows ahead, but the person was gone, or at least, I thought they were. Just as I began to relax, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, there it was again. That head, popping up just a few rows closer this time. This time, they were only 3 rows in front of me, their eyes still fixed on mine. The face was clearer now, and it was even more disturbing than before. They looked lifeless, their face devoid of any emotion. The eyes were wide, almost unnaturally so, as if they hadn't blinked in a long time. My heart raced, my hands clenched into fists on the armrest, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but there was this primal, gut-level fear that washed over me. Without thinking, I shouted, "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" My voice echoed in the empty theater. For a split second, I hoped that my shout would make them stop, maybe even make them get up and leave, embarrassed. But nothing happened. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stayed there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I shot up from my seat, breathing heavily, ready to bolt for the exit. But the thing was, I had to walk past them to get out. The nearest exit was at the far end of the room, and the only way there was down the aisle, directly past where they were crouched. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I forced myself to step forward. I kept my eyes on the figure, not wanting to lose track of them, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run. As I moved closer, the screen lit up for a brief moment with a bright scene, and that's when I saw it clearly. The person wasn't just crouched, they were lying on the floor, and in their hands, they held something. It took my brain a few seconds to process what I was looking at, but when I did, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The person was holding a head, a human head, impaled on some kind of stick. I couldn't move. My body refused to listen to my brain's commands. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the figure held up the head like it was a twisted trophy. The face on the severed head was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, its lifeless eyes wide open, its mouth gaping in a silent scream. I still can't explain what happened next, but somehow, I snapped out of it. The overwhelming need to escape took over, and I ran, full speed, down the aisle, past the rows of seats, past the figure holding that grotesque object. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if they were following me. I just sprinted toward the exit, flung the door open, and stumbled into the cold night air. The rain was still pouring, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them, and it felt like an eternity before I finally got the door open. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and sped out of the parking lot like a bat out of hell. I didn't stop driving until I was home. Even then, I locked every door, closed every window, and sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But nothing made sense. Had I imagined it? Was it a prank? Or was it something much worse? I started searching online for news about recent missing persons. As I scrolled through the articles and photographs, my heart sank when I came across the image of Donald Watkins, a 17-year-old who had been missing for a month. His face was hauntingly familiar, the same shape, the same messy hair, and those wide, empty eyes that mirrored the severed head I had seen in the theater. The resemblance was so striking that I felt a chill race down my spine. I struggled to reconcile what I had seen with reality, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was simply connecting dots that didn't exist. The next day, still shaken, I called the movie theater. I recounted my experience, urging them to check their security footage. I left my number, hopeful they'd find something, anything, that could explain the bizarre encounter. But days turned into weeks, and I never received a call back. Eventually, I chose to put the incident behind me. Life went on, and I tried to return to my normal routine, suppressing the memory of that horrific night. But deep down, the image of Donald's face lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking just out of sight.